In this example, we are going to take one data set and do three different things. The first thing is calculate the predetermined overhead rate. Going forward, I am going to refer to that as the POHR. The second thing we are going to do is use the POHR to allocate overhead to jobs. And the last thing we will do is make the adjusting entry to close the manufacturing overhead account. And I'm going to abbreviate manufacturing overhead as MOH, or MO. Let's get started with the first requirement. So over here is the formula for how to calculate the predetermined overhead rate, which is the estimated or budgeted amount of manufacturing overhead for the entire year. And we're going to divide that by, once again, an estimate, but this time it's the estimated amount of the allocation base used for the entire year. Let's return to our data set and find these two figures. So here we are back to the data set. Since I'm looking for two estimates, both of these items are going to be found in the budgeted column. I'm looking for the total estimated overhead for the year and the total estimated use of the allocation base. Now, what is the allocation base? That always has to be told to you in the question. This question says that overhead is allocated based on the number of machine hours. So that is how I know that for my denominator, the estimated total use of the allocation base is going to be total budgeted machine hours right here. The other item I need is the total estimated overhead. Do you see any number in this budgeted column that says total estimated overhead? No, there isn't one. That means we need to calculate it by identifying each component of overhead and adding them up to get the total budgeted amount. So if we look down at our dollar amounts, we're looking for items that would go in overhead, which would be indirect materials, depreciation on the plant, indirect labor, and plant utilities. None of the other items are overhead. Those are all period costs because they don't relate to the factory. Or, in the case of direct labor here, that's actually one of our product costs. So when you add up the four things that I just put a checkbox next to, you get total budgeted overhead of $156,200. Okay, now I'll go back over here and we'll calculate the predetermined overhead rate. So we'll just follow the formula as written here. Our total estimated overhead from the previous slide was $156,200. And our denominator is going to be our estimated use of the allocation base, which in this case was machine hours. So I'll label these. The denominator was machine hours, and the numerator was our total dollar amount of estimated overhead. The result of this calculation gives you a predetermined overhead rate of $22 per machine hour. We have completed step one, which was to calculate the predetermined overhead rate. Now we'll move on to step two, allocating overhead to jobs. So here we have the formula for how to allocate overhead. We take the predetermined overhead rate, which we calculated in step one, and we're going to multiply it by the actual use of the allocation base for the period. In step one, we already calculated the predetermined overhead rate to be $22 per machine hour. So I'm going to go ahead and input that for the first part of our calculation. Now I need to go back to the data set and determine what the actual use of the allocation base is for the year. So we'll go back to our data set. Remember that our allocation base is machine hours, but instead of looking in the budgeted column, now I want to know the actual amount of machine hours used during the period, which I find right here. 6,500 hours is my actual. I'll go back now to my calculation, actual use of the allocation base, and then I will put in that figure. Now we can multiply to calculate our total dollar amount of allocated overhead, which comes out to $143,000. And that is the completion of step two, calculate the amount of overhead allocated. Now let's move to the final step, which is to determine if manufacturing overhead has been over or under allocated during the period. and determine the adjusting entry to take overhead to 0 at the end of the period. We need to complete the overhead T account by filling in the actual manufacturing overhead costs on the debit side and the allocated amount on the credit side. Then we can determine by the ending balance whether it has been over or under allocated. In the prior question step, we determined that $143,000 of overhead was allocated. So we're going to go ahead and put that under the allocated side. Now we need to figure out total actual overhead. So in order to do that, we need to return to our data set. And now we're going to look at the actual column here. So just like we had to do with the estimated overhead, now we're going to add up the components individually of the actual amounts in order to calculate total actual overhead. So it's going to be the same 4 items that we identified before: indirect materials, depreciation on the plant and equipment, indirect labor, and the plant utilities. Add them up to get total actual overhead, which equals $164,700. Total actual overhead. Now we're going to take that back to our overhead T account and put it in on the debit side, which is where the actual overhead costs go. So here on our debit side, we will put $164,700. Now let's calculate the ending balance in the manufacturing overhead T account. So we have $164,700 on the positive side, the debit side. Then we'll subtract $143,000 on the credit side, which gives us an ending balance of $21,700 on the debit side. If we have an ending balance on the debit side in overhead, it means that actual costs were greater than allocated costs, which means that we underallocated our overhead. But we know that at the end of the period, even though we have a $21,700 debit balance, we have to end the period with overhead at 0. This is where our journal entry comes into play. To take overhead to 0, we need to record a credit to manufacturing overhead of $21,700. We'll put that down here in our journal entry below. But what do we debit? When we take manufacturing overhead to 0, the adjustment account on the other side of the entry is always cost of goods sold. So in this entry, we would credit manufacturing overhead, taking it to 0, and we would debit cost of goods sold by $21,700, which would be increasing the cost of goods sold to compensate for the underallocation of overhead during the period. And now we have accomplished our 3 objectives. We calculated the predetermined overhead rate, we used it to allocate overhead to jobs, and then finally, we figured out the journal entry to close overhead at the end of the year.